Hey kids, Flexing Teacher Weber here. Going to do a bunch more examples on estimating square roots. I know it's a new topic, might seem a little tricky at first, so you gotta be patient, you gotta keep looking at the examples, and hopefully it starts to click, right? So first example here, we're going to estimate the square root of 23. Now, the reason we have to estimate it is that 23 is not a perfect square. How do I know it's not a perfect square? Well, I go back to my perfect square page. And if I look at my perfect squares, 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 23 is not on there. But 23 will be right in between 16 and 25. That's going to be important for later. So I want to estimate the square root of 23. I'm going to make a number line. See, it's the same sort of pattern every time, right? So I'm going to call the top squares. And the bottom square roots. So all the numbers on top will be squares and the bottom will be square roots. Now I want to estimate the square root of 23. To do that, I'm going to use the perfect squares on either side of 23, and we already determined that the perfect square below 23 is 16, and the perfect square above 23 is 25. Now to pinpoint even things more on this number line, I want to find the midpoint of 25 and 16. Now the way I do that is this. I find the space between 25 and 16 by subtracting. That's 9. This is exactly the same as the last question, actually. And then to find half of 9, I divide it by 2, and that's 4.5. So if I add 4.5 onto 16, I will get that the midpoint of 16 and 25 is 20.5, or 20 and 5/10. The reason I do that is because now I have a better idea of where 23 is going to go in this number line. 23 is going to go somewhere in this area, closer to 25. I just do some estimating here. I think 23 will be right about here. Now I want to estimate the square root of 23. To do that, I'm going to use my knowledge of square roots. So the square root of 16 is 4. I'm going to put that on the bottom of the number line. The square root of 25 is 5. Now I know that the square root of 20.5 is going to have to be 4.5, right? Because 20.5 is directly between 16 and 25. So the midway point of 4 and 5 is 4 and 5/10. So now I know the square root of 23 has to be somewhere between 4.5 and 5. Now, this is where I'm going to do my estimating. I'm going to say the square root of 23. I'm going to say it's probably about 4 and 8/10, or approximately 4 and 8/10. And I'll use the rules, and I'll say it's approximately 4 and 8/10. Now when I go to my calculator and do the square root of 23 in my calculator, I get 4.79583152331272. It's not a perfect square root because 23 is not a perfect square, but 4.79583 rounds off very nicely to 4.8, and we have a really good estimate here. When you're doing these sorts of things, I don't expect you to be dead on. I give you a little bit of leeway with your estimates, usually like 1/10 either way. So you don't have to be perfect, right? These are estimates, but you do have to show me all this work to get the estimate. Let's do another one. Okay, getting a little bit larger numbers now. We're going to estimate the square root of 65. Now, if I go to my perfect square page, 65 is not a perfect square. Look at the perfect squares. They're 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, 64, 60, 49, 64. Now we want to estimate the square root of 65. 64 is a perfect square. but not 65. 65 is going to be in between the perfect squares 64 and 81. Okay, I go to my question, and I'm going to do what I did before. I'm going to make a number line. It doesn't have to be a perfectly straight line. That doesn't matter. The number line just helps us picture numbers. I'm going to put the perfect square below and above 65 on this number line. Oh, before I do that, I'm going to label my number line. On top is going to be squares. On the bottom is going to be square roots. Okay, the perfect square below 65 is 64. The perfect square above 65 is 81. Remember, I got those from my perfect square page. Ideally, you have them memorized. That would be the ideal thing. That's what I asked you to do the other day, but keep working on that. Okay, I'm pretty positive that 65 is going to be like super close to 64. But just for kicks and giggles, let's find the midpoint of 81 and 64. Now, the way I do that is I do 81 minus 64, and that equals 17. And then half of 17, I do 17 divided by 2, and I get 8 and 5/10. So that means if I added 8.5 onto 64, I'd have the midpoint of 64 and 81. Now the midpoint then, if I add on 8.5 to 64, the midpoint of this number line is 72 and a half. But that's not really needed in this question because I know that 65 is going to be about right here on the number line, right? So now, to estimate the square root of 65, I use my perfect square knowledge. The square root of 64 is 8. The square root of 81 is 9. The midway square root would be 8 and a half. So that tells me the square root of 65 has to be somewhere between 8 and 8 and a half. Now it's going to be way closer to 8, so I'm going to say it's going to be approximately, because we don't know for sure, approximately 8 and 1/10. When I check on my calculator, it says the square root of 65 is 8.062257. So the square root of 65, a really good estimate to one decimal place, is approximately 8.1, or 8 and 1/10. Okay? Same thing every time, right? Let's try another one. Get to some bigger numbers now. We're going to estimate the square root of 184. Now, 184 is not a perfect square. How do I know? Doink, 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 doink. Look at my list of perfect squares. 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, all the way up. Let's look for 184. Keep going. Okay? 64, 81, 100, 121, 144, 169, 196. 184 is not on here, but 184 will be in between these two perfect squares, the perfect square 169 and 196. So I'm going to go back to my question, and I'm going to do what I did before. Going to make a number line. Call the top of the number line squares. Bottom of the number line, square roots. I'm going to put the perfect squares below and above 184 on the number line. So the perfect square below 184 is 169. The perfect square above 184 is 196. Okay. Now I want to place 184 on this number line. This is where it gets really important to be able to figure out the midpoint of this number line, because it's sort of tricky to picture where 184 is going to go. So to get the midpoint of this number line, I'm going to do 196 subtract 169 to get the midpoint, or to get the range from 196 to 169. I'll do some subtracting there. 16 minus 9 is 7. 8 minus 6 is 2. So the range from 169 to 196 is 27, which means the midpoint is going to have to be half of that. So 27 divided by 2 equals 13 and 5/10. So if I add 13 and 5/10 onto 169, okay, 169 plus 11 is 180, plus 3 more is 184.5. No, 169 plus 11 is 180, plus 2.5 is 182.5. So the midpoint is going to be 182.5. Now, that gives us a good idea where 184 is going to go. So I'm just going to erase this, put it in a better spot. So we'll call this 182.5. That tells me that 184 is probably going to go right about here. So let's do some square rooting now, because we want to estimate the square root of 184. Well, the square root of 169 is 13. The square root of 196 is 14. So the square root of 184 has to be between 13 and 14. Well, the midway point is 182.5, so that midway square root is going to be 13 and a half. So I would say that the square root then of 184 is going to be approximately 13 and 6/10. And I would write that as approximately 13 and 6/10. And when I check my calculator, I get that the square root of 184 is 13.564659. So an estimate of 13.6 is fine and dandy like sour candy. I'm going to do one or two more questions on another video that just show you more estimating square roots. Hopefully you're starting to catch on. Flexing Teacher Weber, out.